Hey, good morning, everybody. Today is a fabulous podcast day. I mean, this is a great one. We normally have a lot of fun on this one, and I need all the help I can get with industry experts. But I'll tell you what, I've got such a great interview lined up for you with Arjun Murti. And I'm horrible at names, but I am so thrilled that you're here this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here, Stu. Thank you.
I think I've had 4 or 5 pots of coffee this morning, so I hope you're ready to have a little bit of fun.
I am. I'm on my second here, so we'll be good to go.
You know, I want to share with all my listeners. I started reading your resume when I reached out to you, and it kept going to the floor. I mean, you've had a lot of great experience, and at 12 years at Goldman Sachs.
15, yes, absolutely.
Oh, 15. Thank you. Oh my goodness. At JP Morgan, Petrie, and then you're a board member at just a whole ton here, including ConocoPhillips and Warburg. But more importantly, you're your own podcast host. I mean, now you have this whole pedigree. Now you're a podcast host.
It's my greatest job so far. So enjoying it.
Isn't that fun? You get addicted to being a podcast host, don't you?
You know, so I've got this 30-year career studying energy markets, mostly as an equity research analyst, as you mentioned, and then more recently, I'm on a board member, an advisory board member, and all this kind of stuff. But there's so much misunderstanding, misinformation, polarization, and all this kind of stuff around energy. I felt some sort of obligation. It's my small way of trying to give back, is just saying, I think there's a lot of nonsense out there in how people talk about energy. It's one of the things, Stu, I've appreciated in listening to some of your podcast episodes. I noticed you brought on a range of people. You have a very positive style of approaching these things, and it attracted me to joining you here today. It's, again, thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'll pay you later for that plug because I need all the help I can get. My goal is to have fun. We talk about some serious topics, and you mentioned one of your colleagues, Bobby Tudor, and I'll tell you, he was a blast as well, too. The depth and knowledge that you guys share, you're taking care of one of the most critical pieces, and that's educating everyone on the goodness of even the energy transition. Let's use all of it. Let's use the cheapest form. Let the market decide. And let's really educate why fossil fuels are not the demon.
I mean, it was my motivation for starting what I'm calling Super Spiked. And so, you know, I thought this whole discussion on energy transition has just gone way off track. And it's sort of been flipped on the head, where people are trying to solve for the externality, the negative externality of perhaps too much CO2, without remembering that there's still billions of people that don't have the energy in the first place. And I think it's not even just bridging that gap. It's frankly reprioritizing. You first need to have energy for all. It then has to be affordable. It then has to be reliable and secure. And then while you're solving that, ideally, it has as small of a climate and carbon and environmental footprint as possible. And that is important, but you have to provide energy for people first. You can't start taking it away.
You know, the hypocrisy drives me nuts. And I mean, you know, that's a technical term in Oklahoma and Texas, just drives me nuts. There's a few other acronyms for that. But we're forcing renewable energy on Africa when they've got so many other resources. We got to our society by using fossil fuels. Why are we forcing that same thing on them?
I mean, I think it's hard. For some reason, people have forgotten that we are living in perhaps the most prosperous time in human history. We've had massive population growth. We have the least number of people in poverty. Unfortunately, we still have, depending on how you're counting, 1 to 4 billion people still living in unacceptable conditions, and 2 billion people coming into the world who will mostly be going to those same countries that are quite challenged today. And so it's not, you know, we've had to deal with negative externalities with fossil fuels certainly throughout our lifetimes. We used to have lead in gasoline. We elected to take steps to get rid of it. We used to have too much sulfur. We've taken steps to get rid of that. We do need to decarbonize. There's no call that we don't need to decarbonize, but the suggestion that fossil fuels are evil or bad, it does not match up with the history of the last 150 years.
And haven't you seen over the last bunch of years, with all your experience in talking to EMPs, talking to downstream folks, talking to the upstream, that the oil companies actually trying to help and clean things up? I mean, you're seeing that, aren't you?
I mean, I think, it's hard to know how any company would have thought 50 or 40 years ago, but the idea that the current management teams are, as they'd say, our fathers or grandfathers' management teams, and all of society's evolved. And I find, I'm from the Northeast. I grew up in New Jersey. I did not grow up in an oil community or with any sort of oil. My parents just told me my grandfather apparently worked for Shell in India, 100 years ago or something like that. So maybe there's some genes in there. But I grew up in an area that did not interact with these, and I have loved my 30 years of getting to know some great Texans, Oklahomans, Calgarians, as they say, and it's been a wonderful industry to interact with. And I find the management teams are generally good faith about wanting to help and do the right things. So.
And the US and Canada's ESG methodology is so much better than the rest of the world. I mean, we at least have some decent standards. And if we just follow those standards, China doesn't follow them. A lot of the other Middle Eastern countries, and Russia definitely doesn't follow them. So if you buy US energy, you're buying a better ESG product.
So you've touched upon one of the first drivers of, again, why I've started producing Super Spiked, is this idea that, let's just say you do want to limit our usage of fossil fuels or something like that. The idea that you should start with Canada and Alaska and the United States is beyond my ability to comprehend, when all that means, since there are not policies in place to really address the demand side of the equation, which we could talk about, but if you're just the idea that you can kill supply, again, only in certain places, and that somehow that's going to lead to decarbonization or a reduction in demand is preposterous. All you do is shift the barrels to less friendly, less secure, less environmentally conscious regions like Russia, like Iran, like Iraq, and so forth. And I don't understand that perspective. So again, even for the diehard environmentalist or climate person who says CO2 first, that's all I care about. Why would you want to shut down the Canadian and Alaskan and US oil industry first before you have addressed the rest of the world, which is far more challenged?
Canada's got some big regulations, but those oil sands, doesn't that make sense to bring down the oil sands because it's a heavier grade? And I'm kind of stupid sometimes. And so when you bring that heavier crude down through the Keystone pipeline, we have less need for buying heavier crude from other bad people. Wouldn't that make sense?
That's right. And I actually was just talking about this in last week's post, and I did a Twitter Spaces over the weekend, which is it gets this tagline, highest cost, dirtiest barrel in the world. And I don't think either is true. And so the Canadian companies actually screen out as ESG leaders on a variety of metrics. They've got this Pathways Alliance, which is a grouping of some of the 6 largest Canadian producers to help decarbonize the barrel through a carbon capture hub project. That will actually then put the Canadian oil sands on par with any other region. And then last time I checked, Canada is a pretty friendly country. It's been a great ally. I think the odds of it either being invaded or invading someone else is as close to zero as you can get. So when you look at geopolitical risk, this should be a favored barrel. And I think for all those reasons, I don't understand this hostility towards infrastructure. And the hostility is from both the Canadian federal government and the US government. And so from both sides, I'm not sure I understand it. So.
And it's the US and Canadian consumers that are the losers. And that drives me nuts.
Not just Americans and Canadians. It is also the consumers in the rest of the world. So let's just say you are someone in the middle of Africa who has very little. And someone will say, let's shut down for climate reasons the US and Canadian oil industry. So then those people should be dependent on Iran, Russia, Saudi. Where's the justice in that? If this is one of the terms we're going to use, environmental and economic justice, what is the justice for someone in Ghana, in Nigeria, in any of these countries, India, other parts of Southeast Asia, for them to then suddenly be dependent on these worst barrels, is the term I use, I'm an American, that's the term I use, the worst barrels from places like Russia and the Middle East. We should want to give our oil through exports, or at least help supply US and its allies with Canadian and US barrels.
Well, as energy independence is important, and when we reached energy independence, it's us exporting, but we still have to import because of blending mixes. And so it's a little bit of a complicated formula. And I don't know the answer to this one, but wouldn't it make sense that if we didn't, the last big refinery was 1978, I believe, something like that.
76, that's right. It's a marathon plant, Garyville, if I'm remembering correctly. So,
and then we've got all these little ones that we've been upgrading in order to get here. Wouldn't it make sense that we would allow regulations to update our refineries to cleaner standards and use the lighter crude that we produce here? And that way we wouldn't have to import. I don't understand why what the thing is on that.
I mean, in fact, the refineries have been going in the other direction, where they've actually been transitioning their plants from crude oil-based inputs to, renewable fuels type products. Right. And it's fine. The renewable diesel is, physically comparable to crude oil-based diesel, but then you lose a whole bunch of gasoline and other products that you would have produced in the refinery in the first place. And I will say, most of these decisions by the independent refiners have been made for economic reasons. So I think in that case, I don't blame government policy per se, but there certainly have not been incentives. There's not been any sort of energy policy that says we should make sure we have sufficient gasoline and diesel capacity here in the United States. And we do run the risk of becoming more dependent on the rest of the world.
But also on the pricing on that, I believe that last year there was a price difference between biodiesel and just regular diesel. I think $2, which is a ton. I don't think biodiesel gets us $2 a gallon better. I could be wrong on that.
Well, you're actually right. So here's an example where the only reason you have that price differential or the ability to produce a renewable diesel is because of the tax credits, the low carbon fuel standard LCFS, which comes out of California and various states, that de facto subsidizes this transition away from crude oil based refineries which provide a range of products to these renewable fuels plants that basically only provide renewable diesel. There is a tax policy incentive to, again, shut down the old plants and transition to these newer ones.
Okay, there we go with my favorite word after this weekend, taxes. Go figure that. I mean, that one's holy smokes. When we talk about, you've got crude oil commodity markets 101, we're hearing different things. I put on a crayon last year that I thought that it would be about 110 to 120 through the whole year, just as what my crayon math was doing. And I loved your crude oil commodity comments that we're going to have volatility, and volatility is a good thing. Why is volatility a good thing?
Well, I'll clarify that a little bit. I would just say volatility is inevitable. Whether it's good or bad, we can judge. I think politicians hate volatility when it's to the upside. They, of course, like it when it's to the downside. And I would say they're actually aligned with consumers who feel the same way. I would just say it's an inevitability. When you have a commodity like crude oil, where the elasticity of both demand and supply is very low, meaning if prices go up a lot in a very short period of time, you just can't magically bubble more oil out of the ground. You have to go through an investment cycle. So elasticity of supply is low. By the same measure, though, just about everybody has no choice but to drive their car somewhere. And so the price of gasoline has to get really, really high to motivate a change in behavior. So elasticity is very low, but it works in both directions. So once you get to that price, where you do start to back off demand, it could be for economic reasons or otherwise, then it can fall quite precipitously and quite quickly, which is what we've seen. So I would say no one should expect a stable environment. It is not the nature of oil markets. Frankly, for those that are more bullish on crude oil, that's going to come with inherently more volatility because of these reasons of elasticity. And so I just say it's neither good nor bad. It is here. And when I speak to corporate executives, my comment is you need to embrace it and figure out where you are in the volatility cycle and try and take advantage of it as best as you can.
Wow. I actually understood that. That's cool. Well done.
That's my goal, Stu. I've lived and breathed this from a very narrow Wall Street perspective for 30 years. And I do think there's a need to make energy and commodity markets accessible to a much broader group of people. So
I love the way that you're doing that, because I see communication from the oil and gas side outward and teaching, because we only hear part of the story, and that's one of my platforms, is getting out there and really trying to share that. What do you think with our geopolitical problems? I mean, that's a whole nother topic is there well too, but do you, I don't think sanctions work. And do you think us trying to stop the Russian or cap Russian prices is even, I don't think it's going to work. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. And I think if anything, if we're going to give the Russian oil industry some credit here, they've had a whole bunch of restrictions and blockages and
right.
stuff put on them, and they actually have redirected the flows much quicker than we thought. So I always thought the expectation their supply would fall 3 million barrels a day was overstated, but their ability to basically redirect almost all their flows almost immediately, meaning within a few months, to China and India and elsewhere. I mean, it does speak to when crude oil prices are high, supply that is around is going to find a way. So I think this effort or attempt, and again, it gets to the fundamental premise that we started with, which is if you weaken the domestic industry, US and Canada, you just create stronger conditions for President Putin in Russia and other, again, as an American, I'm going to call bad actors in the world. And it does speak to the need to, I mean, I think if we actually had policy that promoted both US and Canadian supply growth, and with it some demand reductions here, you could displace all Russian and Iranian barrels by 2030. Now, they may still exist in the world, but at least the US and our allies would no longer be held hostage to these rogue regimes. And I think that is entirely possible from shale, oil sands, and a little bit of domestic demand reduction.
Do you see also the consortium, as Putin has really been successful on the ruble? The ruble's doing fantastic. Do you see Russia, China, and Iran moving it away from the dollar, and the dollar getting weaker because of their movements?
You know, throughout my career, there's been talk that the days of US dollar hegemony is doomed, that it won't be the world's reserve currency. And if you look, I'm not a currency expert, Stu, so I'll speak out of school here because you have such a positive approach and I want to answer your question. We have had changes in reserve currencies. It used to be the pound sterling, it used to be gold. And so it's not destined that the dollar will always be dominant for the rest of time, but there's no viable alternative that certainly I see at this moment. And China, of course, is very integrated into the Western world. All of our iPhones, everything you and I are using to produce this very broadcast, of course, is ultimately sourced in China. And so the idea that they can cut themselves off from the rest of the world, I think is going to be the flying the ointment of trying to create a new block between Russia, China, and Iran. China is more dependent on us than we are on them, even if it feels at the moment that our supply chains are somewhat dependent on China.
You know, you're hearing those rumors out there that they're bankrupt and that they're going to have some serious problems. So I think we're in a time, Arjun, that we should just buckle up. It's going to be totally crazy. I mean, there's a forecast for you.
You know, I will say this, I'm actually very optimistic on the United States. We have population growth, which is ultimately key. China's population is actually going to age. I think they reached I think it's back half of this decade, their one-child policy is going to really come home to roost and having a negative impact on their population. We have population growth. A lot of it comes through immigration, probably not a topic we need to get into, but population growing is a good thing. We are blessed with resources. We're blessed with both the skilled, highly skilled, and a lower skilled workforce. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for us to rebuild manufacturing and supply chains here in the US. We have massive oil and gas resources. We could have some of the resources for tomorrow's technologies. That's probably something you talked about with Bobby in terms of lithium and some of the rare earth mines. There's a lot we can do if we want to do in this country. And I'm very bullish on America and Canada and North America in particular. So.
I love your attitude. That is so cool. When we talk about ESG investing and the impact that it's had on, there's a couple of things. I love our big oil companies when they stood up in front of, and they were getting their beating. I mean, they're interviewing before the Congress, and they said, "Are you going to not give back to investors so you can drill more?" And they kept trying to sneak this in, but every one of them said, "No, we're going to give back to our investors and we're going to produce more." I respected them for it. I was like, yeah, stand up to them.
I was trying not to drive myself crazy by watching that ridiculous congressional hearing. I think the title was price gouging or some kind of nonsense like that. And I have to say, to my surprise, if you had Democrats, Republicans, and oil executives, it was the oil executives that clearly stood out as the adults in the room. Now, without getting too political, I thought the left of center was ridiculous, but the right of center was also going for the equivalent gotcha in the other direction. I did not find it substantive from either party. And I will say it was the oil executives that were trying their best, to their credit, to give thoughtful answers. And it kind of harks back to an earlier question you asked. I don't think this is the oil executives from 50 years ago. They're actually quite thoughtful on a range of subjects, including ESG, as well as some of these other topics.
Well, I was back there just spiking my tablet, and my wife was like, "Why are you happy?" I'm like, "They're standing up finally." I'm over there cheering.
They need to stand up more. I mean, Stu, why is it that you have this podcast where you're trying to educate and bring people on? I both write and do some video and so forth. You need the executives to engage. It's a very insular industry, a bunch of petroleum engineers and geoscientists, and because they don't have a consumer business. They've not had to gauge it. So we critique the public in Congress for not understanding energy, frankly, and for taking it for granted. They're as guilty. They do not sell their product. They do not sell their business. They do not engage. Toby Rice is an exception to the rule.
Great.
CEO of EQT. And he's probably a little bit younger than some of the other CEOs. We need more like that. It can't just be you and I, Stu, two people out there trying to make the case here. You need the executives to stand up, and maybe that congressional hearing is the start of something.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't you and I take that challenge and let's get them on your podcast, my podcast. Let's have a forum, and let's interview Toby and a few of the others. I think that would be absolutely fun. I'd love to have you talk to him.
I mean, I'll say this respectfully to both you and I, Stu, looking at both of our hairstyles, we're probably not at the earlier points of our lifetimes, and we've been able to make friends with social media, right? I used to be scared to death of it when I was still at Goldman, and now I enjoy being out there. I did Twitter Spaces of all things, right?
Isn't that cool?
It is very cool. And, these oil executives cannot use the excuse that they're too old or the lawyers are stopping them. They're going to have to engage with the public because it's critically needed. There's a moral imperative to making people understand better why we use energy, how to make it available and affordable for all, but ideally dealing with some of the negative externalities.
I love Chris Wright over at Liberty Frac, and he is so passionate.
He's another good one. Yep.
He is passionate about the poor, the disproportionately impacted communities. I love Chris, and anytime I've talked to him in the past, he has just been a true passionate person about getting the low cost power. We need more of those guys.
No question about it. And I think so one of the things I talk about is it's not about appeasement. And I think that to some degree, these sustainability reports these companies put out, they read apologetically. I think there's a lot of substantive things they should do. You should be safe. Your workforce your workers should come to work and be able to leave work. So worker safety is paramount. Health, safety, environment, trying to address your methane flaring. I think that's something industry should do a better job of. But the idea that you're apologizing for your product, that is one of the things I appreciate about Chris Wright saying, no, this is why we use energy. And this is why what we're doing is actually good and helpful to the world. And if you don't do it, then the narrative from the other side is going to win out, which it is winning out. And that is unfortunate.
I'll tell you what. Okay. So let's back up with all your experience at Goldman Sachs. If you can't tell, I just enjoy talking to people about energy and prices. And of course, this is the way I am about a lot of stuff. But when you talk about your experience at Goldman Sachs, and then you take a look at how the ESG model did funnel back and change, that we're just not going to funnel all this back into CapEx. We're going to be giving money back to the investors. And so now you see that with all these billions of great returns and profits, they're giving it back to their investors, and they're trying to increase their CapEx, and they're trying to do both. Do you think the ESG movement impacted that in a positive way?
Well, so I think ESG currently, and up until this moment of time that we're talking here in August of 2022, is kind of getting either too much blame or too much credit for what these companies are doing. And so for the last decade, I'll make this long story short, returns on capital for shale E&Ps actually average 0%, not 3%, not 4%, it was zero. So when you've earned de facto no money for a decade, investors at the first sign of money say, hey, go spend it again, right? So, so investors have been hesitant to come back to the sector, and they've said, you better give us all the money back this time. Now, there is absolutely a need to grow supply, or the world will be short oil, and that's not a good thing for anybody, including these companies ultimately. But I'd say that has been the overwhelming driver. I think the ESG concerns become a prospective concern, meaning at some point, if you keep putting roadblocks on where people can invest, if you declare that oil sands are, quote, too dirty and Arctic is too dangerous or dirty, then you've basically shut off Canada and Alaska from CapEx. And that is not okay. So I would view the ESG concern as a go-forward concern. And it's kind of this combination of virtue signaling and the sort of overemphasis on purely CO2 as the only thing we care about. We care about it. It's just not the only thing we care about as being the future risk to ESG. Now, there are some ESG things these companies need to do. There is an argument that governance at some companies could be improved. It can't be that only men, as an example, can run oil companies. There must be at least some women, that might be capable of running oil companies. There are people from different backgrounds that might. So there are some things along those lines that I think are needed. And if you're going to want to attract a future workforce, it's for right now, if everybody wants to go into tech, how do you make your industry appealing to attract that next generation of workers? And it could be folks from different backgrounds who want to come work in the industry, who you should be going after. So that's the ESG stuff that I think it's needed. It's the climate-only ideology. Don't invest in fossil fuel CapEx. That part of ESG is a future risk as this cycle progresses. Okay,
I'm just going to make sure that our transcriber gets that it's ideology instead of idiotology. Because I would say it ideology, and so I know that you would not say that. So I just wanted to clear that.
I might incorporate that now that I'm on social media. I like that.
Yeah, do you get trolls the climate trolls on you? Do they I got the UN on me. I finally got one of my podcasts that the UN put a warning on my podcast, and I'm like, I got a badge of honor now. The UN hates me.
Well, the UN's a whole nother topic. What I would say, Stu, is I've actually been very proud that I've had notes tweeted out or forwarded on by both who I know to be very right of center oil company CEOs, but in the same note also tweeted out by what I'm going to call the pragmatic climate and environmentally oriented people. Clearly not the far left environmentalists, but there's some actually pretty constructive and pragmatic environmental groups out there. I'm thinking of folks like EDF and Ceres that I respect some of the people there and the work they're doing and their desire to proactively engage with the oil industry. I think we need more of that. So I've been very proud of that. And I think, I had a career at Goldman where I used to deal with some of these crazy hedge fund types and so forth. And my view is always, I'm not going to talk to anyone who's just sort of disingenuously not nice. Now they can disagree with me. I love the debate. Absolutely love the debate. But the difference between that and kind of being not nice, if you will. And I'd never talk to them. And so I felt like if I was able to have a successful career at Goldman without having to just sort of kowtow to every jerk out there, I can apply that to social media. So I've tried to keep my engagements positive. I try not to be too political or too extremist about it. I do think we do need to care about sustainability and some of these climate and environmental considerations. It's just not the be all and end all for me. Providing energy for all is my be all and end all. So
I'm taking my iWatch off, and it's a habit. And in the old days, I used to, as a selling to executives or something, as soon as that executive looked at his watch, I ended the meeting and I arranged to come back. And here I am violating one of my own rules. These drive me nuts. And I'm
not insulted if you're getting tired of talking to me. It's all good, Stu. So.
Oh, no, you don't understand. I'm having one of the greatest conversations I've had. And when we sit down and really take a look, we've talked about ESG, we've talked that. I love your Substack. And so everybody needs to join your Substack to get your opinions. And I love Substack from the standpoint, it's not going to be censored. And I think that that's a true outlet for you that you need.
I mean, I hope it's not going to be censored. I mean, I'm probably personally not a risk at it, but there are folks who I subscribe to on Substack who I think have been proven right on some of their views, topics like whether it's COVID and vaccines and these kind of things. And again, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but I think they've had some different views, and portions of those views, those different views, have actually proven to be very correct. And the sort of mainstream overwhelming media narrative that there's only this one path and there's only this one set of outcomes, and we're all going to believe in, quote, the science. I've appreciated Substack that it's allowed people with different voices to state their views. And some of those views are not correct, but you should be able to state them within kind of any sort of realms of normal bounds. And I do make my Substack for free because I do this for, an educational type purposes and networking, but education would be the primary purpose. So.
I tell you, I really enjoy it. And there's other Substack folks that I do. And I just highly encourage anybody wanting to be an author. It seems to be a very good platform. If you see your crystal ball, and I'm not referring to our haircuts, I'm saying, I can make this joke.
I once had long hair. I mean, I have some pictures from high school, which I tell my son, you better enjoy your hair while you've got it, buddy. So.
Oh, hell fun. So did I. But I have so many accidents that my head actually looks like it's got lumps on it, like a Klingon. So, anyway. So when we take a look at forward pricing for the rest of the balance of this year, what you say that you're in your predictions in some of your articles is between 35 and 120. 170 is less than 1%. So, people are saying, how come you're not having a better crystal ball? It's tough.
Yeah, so I'm personally out of the public price prognostication business. But I'll give you some parameters. So I prefer to argue that we are going to be in a 25 to 30% volatility environment. And so I measure it versus a rolling 5-year average. That 5-year average is still actually like $62 a barrel. 25 vol on that means you should expect $15 to nearly $20 a barrel swings. Now, we know that $50 oil last 5 years generated a 0% return on capital for shale. So that is too low. When you start getting to $70 to $80 a barrel, you start getting an acceptable level of return on capital. But we then know that between companies having had such poor profitability last decade and some of these go forward ESG concerns about you can't invest here and you can't invest there, and we're not going to allow new pipelines in the places that have supply like the US and Canada, then you know that you're going to have a supply constrained environment. So you start then thinking some of that volatility is going to be decently to the upside. Now, does that average 100? Does it average 80? I mean, I'll leave that to the Goldman Sachs's and Morgan Stanley's of the world. But I prefer saying from a profitability standpoint, I do think we're in a super cycle. So cool. 10 to 15 years up, 10 to 15 years down. I think if you were to invite me back on, Stu, in 2030, we will look back at the 2020s and say the oil and gas companies made a lot of returns on capital, dividended it out a lot to shareholders. And I think by the time we get to that period, they will have also grown supply that the world needs. I think they'll be able to do all three. And I think we're looking at a very good decade here where oil and gas goes back to being a leadership sector in the S&P 500.
Oh, nice. And it is. It seems like it's one of the safe places for folks to get through this because energy is up hugely right now. One last question here as we go through, and then I'll give you the last word on this. OPEC, Russia, and Iran, they met with, OPEC plus and all that. And there's a big question out there, how much extra, production that they can actually do. But then you take a look just real briefly at last year's numbers that Russia and Saudi Arabia published for their budgets. You take a look at those budgets, and my magic crayon came out, and I started going, and it matched my other numbers in that 110 to 120. And I'm going, I couldn't have imagined these numbers over here matching to their budgets for this year. Putin is well, what, 14 billion over his projected numbers. They're forcing their ideology of pricing. Do you see any changes with that? They love the high prices.
I think for all practical purposes, we're out of any spare capacity of any kind anywhere in the world. So whether it's Saudi or OPEC more broadly, Russia may be doing a better job hanging on to their supply, but the idea that it's going to grow 1% a year, which it had been, now that they're a pariah state, I think I will take out all future Russian growth. And it's just a question then of how many years until it really starts rolling over. In the shale, we had built up all these drilled but uncompleted wells. Those have been basically drawn down, and the below ground, the storage inventories are all basically at low levels. So however you slice or dice it, you're out of spare capacity. And the only way to get out of that is CapEx. It is the only way. It does not magically bubble out of the ground. So the kind of environment I think we're in for the 2020s will be one where you continue to bump up against that demand destruction price. That's the volatility point, the inelasticity of supply and demand. If you're not going to invest and it's not going to come up, and again, it's a global point, you're going to have to keep getting into this sort of recessionary type environment. And every time you come out of it, you kind of very quickly get out of spare capacity. I think when I look at the Middle East countries, they need a major CapEx cycle, and only Saudi has announced some semblance of Saudi Arabia has announced some higher CapEx. Need a lot more from just them if you want to rebalance this thing.
Cool. Well, I tell you, is it 4 trillion or a trillion? What's a few trillion between friends? But doesn't the world need that much CapEx investment just to maintain normal decline curves? I heard that some number somewhere. I don't know if I dreamt it or something.
It needs a lot more than we're doing. And it's an excellent point. So even in the environment where demand doesn't grow, and I actually think this idea that crude oil demand is peaked is preposterous when there's still so many people who don't have anything. But let's just say for some reason it has peaked. The decline rates, as you point out, that can be anywhere from 5, 7, 10% or more, depending on the field. And you have to spend quite a bit just to keep that production flat. And again, we're coming out of a period where you've drawn down the easy stuff, the ducts, the OPEC spare capacity, and so forth. So you're going to need a real CapEx cycle here. And again, because companies did poorly last decade, they're being more, quote, disciplined this time around because there's ESG concerns, the bad kind, the virtue signaling kind. It's going to push out the timing of this CapEx cycle, which means I think we'll keep butting up against these demand destruction price, super high vol environment for the commodity.
Wow. I like that. That's such a great, I would love to sit down and talk with you for hours because I'm just having a great time and I know I'm taking too much of your time. Can you give me your last thoughts on where you're going next?
For me personally, and maybe for the industry broadly, I think there does have to be a mission that it is completely unacceptable that there are still so many people without any energy. I live in New Jersey where we have blackouts at least once a year, where our power goes out for at least a day, if not several days. And it is like the world has ended. You try having, young adult, teenage kids, and never mind myself and my wife, when the power is out, the world is ending and society breaks down. The Dunkin' Donuts is all messy and dirty, and it's just a disaster. And we live in one of the richest, luckiest parts of the world. So what is it like for the folks in rural India and rural Africa and these parts of the world? And how can you make them do without? There is a moral obligation to provide people with energy. And I think it's all kinds of energy. So I think I would actually love this house to have a geothermal heat pump because then I don't have to depend on JCP&L. That may be not such a bad thing. So I'm not against the other stuff. But the idea that you should only do that, the idea that you're going to depend on intermittent resources for baseload is ridiculous, right? And so nuclear power, nuclear power has got nothing to do with any company I'm involved with, as far as I know. Let's have a nuclear power build out. That is your chance of baseload power. That is your chance of carbon-free power. Where is that calls for that? And so there's a lot of these you have to solve for energy availability, affordability, reliability, security, and then with it, hopefully as small of a climate and environmental footprint. So my mission is to continue to spread that word. And so I appreciate all that you're doing, Stu. the CEOs need to do their part. They're the missing
Right.
link here. They got to learn how to engage publicly. And I think the industry does have a responsibility to be profitable and to have
Right.
investors come back to the sector so that they can invest in supply that the world needs. So,
Well done. And I'll tell you, I'm going to have all your information and where to follow you at and everything else, because I just truly appreciate your thought, industry leadership, and your attitude and your hairline. So
that is very kind of you, Stu. And I've not found too many people with a lot of hair promoting this stuff. So we actually do need some people who are more diverse than you and I from a hairstyle perspective. And maybe that actually some of your folks who are in the background here, they have much nicer hair than we do. Maybe we should get them in front of camera. So
I believe me, I've been beating on Michael to get that done. So thank you very much. And to my fans out there, we'll see you next time.